Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Damien Cantwell and I'm the ACT Electoral Commissioner, and I'd like to welcome you all to the candidate and party briefing for the 2020 ACT Legislative Assembly elections. We've just gone past the start time and I note that others are joining us as I speak, but that's okay. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the ACT, the Ngunnawal people. I'd like to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution that make to the life of this great city and this region. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending or joining us at today's briefing. Just a couple of administrative points before we get into the briefing. This is an unusual circumstance, but one which now I think in the last few months we've all become accustomed to, that is by working remotely and engaging with each other remotely, and this follows that very model. I'd like to ask that you use the chat facility that's available on this format to identify questions, to raise questions throughout the session as they come to mind. I will ask for questions briefly related to this section that I will speak to before handing over to my deputy, Mr. Rose Spence. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end to more fully engage with you all, so as to ensure that as best able in the time we have permitted here this afternoon, you're able to raise your questions and we're able to answer them. But where we are not able to do that, I'd ask that you keep a note of those questions. We'll record those on the chat facility and we'll get to them, if not during this next couple of hours, as soon as we can thereafter. Please, for the benefit of all, I'd ask that you keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the presentation, other than during the question and answer session when you might have a question to ask. And my staff here will help us manage through that. And when you're identifying or raising a question via the chat, and indeed later on during the question and answer session, it would be very useful for us all if you can identify yourself by your full name and organisation or the person that you're representing. Okay, so with that, by way of introduction, I want to firstly highlight that Elections ACT committed to providing the very highest standards of electoral services for the 2020 election. You're all very much aware of the pandemic environment in which we are living and operating. And that in itself has caused some uncertainty around the elections themselves and for you and as parties and candidates and the like and stakeholders in this outcome. Clearly some uncertainty about how we're going to conduct the election and how you're going to operate within it. So now having had the most recent legislation passed by the ACT Assembly and having received advice of the financial arrangements that we need to deliver the model that we intend to deliver, I'm now in a position to be able to brief you more formally as to how we will conduct the election. The first point I wish to make is that this will be a COVID-safe election. That is, we'll conduct this in a way that reinforces the community health preventative measures which have been in place and put in place now for some time by the ACT government. We will adhere to those to ensure that voters, electoral staff and all the stakeholders involved in this process are safe under the COVID-safe provisions throughout this election. The next point I wish to make is that this is an election over a period of time. That is a period of the 28th of September to the 17th of October. Rather than a single traditional polling day with a limited number of early vote locations available, this will be a voting period, again from the 28th September to the 17th of October. And there will be a number, an enhanced number, intentionally up to 15 early voting centres available across the ACT over that voting period, and then the traditional or normal number of voting and polling locations established on the 17th of October itself. The purpose of that arrangement is to provide the safest means by which voters can go to a polling location of their choice at a time of their choice and vote so as to enhance their own personal safety provisions under the current and ongoing COVID pandemic conditions. Now, there will be a range of health and safety measures in place at each of those early voting locations and they will be enforced by security assistance to ensure that we all are looking after each other as we exercise our democratic right and we take part in these elections. Can I offer also that this is a presentation today, very much a public engagement in the first instance, but it's also an opportunity for you to take some of our key messages forward and inform your own constituents as we go forward from this time, and as you will continue to be updated by information both on the ACT government appropriate websites about health provisions, but also the electoral related information contained on elections ACT websites. I'd ask that you take those key messages forward to your own constituents and help inform them about the COVID safe provisions, the opportunity and the recommendation from Elections ACT to take the opportunity to vote early so as to reduce their health risks, and to also note that this is a non-standard election but operating across an election period with COVID safe provisions in place. So there's some key messages that I'll ask you to consider there, and we'll elaborate the impact of some of those as we go through this presentation. Speaking of websites and information, this slide you'll see later on as we conclude, but I want to throw it to you now so that you've got a reference point whereby you can continue to draw updated information. Of course, our own website, you can contact the staff through the locations identified on the website, but also you can get access to the frequently asked question sheets and fact sheets and important documents such as the scrutineering manual and the like. And importantly for candidates and parties, information about funding and disclosure. I'd also refer you to the ACT government webpage that relates to COVID-19. I'm sure you're all familiar with that now, but I recommend it to you as your prime source of information that relates to the community health provisions in the ACT. Indeed, I'd also like to advise that the plan and the delivery model that we will proceed with in this election is very much informed by the best information and advice we've received from ACT Health as we progress with our planning. The way we'll proceed is I will cover some COVID safety provisions and measures that are relevant to the 2020 election delivery. My deputy, Rose Spence, who many of you will know well from previous elections, will then walk through the information as listed in the dot points on the slide, talking to specifics around electronic voting and counting. We've got some very welcome, exciting new arrangements in EVAC so as to make that facility even more accessible and more user-friendly for our voters. And looking forward to seeing that roll out in operation for this election, particularly under a COVID arrangement. Right, we'll talk to the authorisation issues, speak to some issues around disinformation, and I'd introduce now the phrase "check your source," which you'll see feature predominantly in the Elections ACT information campaign. That element of our information campaign seeks to address the matter that's, I think, become more apparent in other elections elsewhere and internationally as well, where the amount of information or the integrity and reliability of some of the information related to election campaigning might be questionable, and therefore we remind all electors of their own individual responsibility to not take everything that they're given at face value, but rather to do their own review and analysis of the information and the integrity of information they're being presented to make an informed choice. Rob will also talk about nomination of candidates, loves talking about expenditure caps and penalties, but particularly he's very excited to talk about funding and disclosure this afternoon. It's a complicated area and an ongoing area of refinement. And to that point, I offer that we still have a little bit of work to do to update the information on our own website. We need to properly include within our some of the information in the frequently asked questions and fact sheets that reflect the most recent legislative changes, another point that we'll talk to, but also to ensure that we're giving you the most current information as we progress through this early election period. And again, we'll refine those. My undertaking to you all is that we'll have those in place before early August, so that we have the most current and accurate information available to you and all the stakeholders in this process as we go forward. Now look, there's been a number of particular provisions made for this election. And I'll just talk to some of those now without wanting to get into too much detail, because some of this will be relevant to you, but particularly so in the context of how it affects your campaigning and what you expect to see in the election or the voting period from 28th September. Look, the ACT Legislative Assembly, I know we have some representatives from the Assembly, MLAs joining us this afternoon, have most recently passed an amendments to enable the delivery of the election model for 2020. And there are some significant differences, and the first of those is highlighted on this slide here. For this election, all voters will be considered eligible voters to vote early. That is, previously where you had to make a statement to declare that you were not eligible to vote on polling day, you're now able to do that and not have to make such a statement. So all voters are eligible to vote in the election period, otherwise known as early voting. And I'd actively encourage you and your constituents to take up the opportunity to do exactly that. I offer that because it provides an additional means of preventative health measures and reduces the risk of any one voter being exposed to potential delays or queues in voting. And I encourage all voters, and it'll be part of our information campaign, to encourage people to take up the opportunity that's now being legislated for and to vote early. We'll also, on our website, provide a means by which voters and all stakeholders can see the trends or the peaks and troughs in voting wait times over the election period. From the information, we hope that individual voters can make informed decisions about when to go and vote, to in turn reduce the risk that they might be caught up in some crowds that otherwise they may have otherwise been able to predict were going to be there. And then again, reducing any risk of breaching of social distancing that's required, and to ensure that they're able to get in and vote quickly and efficiently and without having to run any additional risks under the COVID pandemic conditions. With regard to social distancing, look, we are aware of those arrangements. Of course, they're in every public messaging around public health and the ACT. We're all familiar with them and they've become part of the way we operate. But I think like many of you, I've seen many of us in the shopping centres and the malls and the like at the moment potentially breaching such social distancing as we become more relaxed and as we get back into our shopping and normal rhythms of our lives. For the voting though, I will be enforcing those social distancing requirements. I will employ some security assistance to help remind people where the social distancing limits physically apply, and we'll set up the polling locations so as to that to be really visible to all voters. Now, this is about protecting ourselves as electoral staff, but importantly to protect our voters and all the stakeholders involved in this process. We'll have a regular application of disinfectant. All touchable and touched surfaces will be regularly wiped down during the voting period and in between voting use. We'll have hand sanitizers and the like readily available at each location. The pencils that will be issued will be use, take with you and use as you wish. The staff, you will notice, will be wearing personal protective equipment, and at this point that will extend to including masks, gloves and the like where that decision might be taken, and that will also be the requirement for any of the scrutineers who wish to take part in the scrutineering process. Rob will talk further to detail of that shortly, but I'll alert you now to that requirement as part of the scrutineering process. There will be changes in the way that's conducted to accommodate our utmost requirement to ensure our health and safety of our staff and, of course, those represented parties by way of scrutineering. So some important issues to be taken into account there. And again, that scrutineer's handbook will be updated to reflect some of those procedural changes. So I'll also offer, there's some other legislative amendments, and I won't elaborate upon those right now, but they do include the capacity for the elections ACT to conduct a limited overseas e-voting service for those eligible ACT voters who wish to cast or have to cast their votes overseas, and also a telephone voting service for the blind and visually impaired. Again, we're excited to be able to offer those provisions and services to the voting community across ACT in this period. It's a great initiative or set of initiatives that we've got now the legislation and funding in place to deliver, and it's all about ensuring full inclusivity across our ACT voting community and encouraging them to take part in the democratic process. We'll be working through those progressively and we update information on the website and through the information campaign to inform the members of our community who might need to take up those particular services. So in summary, before I hand over to Ro, or take questions, hand over to Ro, there are some significant challenges that we are working through as a community in this pandemic era, and the conduct of elections will be conducted in a COVID-safe manner along those lines I've described. It's going to be a COVID-safe election. There's a voting period as opposed to a single polling day with a limited early voting period. There's now a voting period, 28th September to the 17th of October, with a traditional number of polling locations available on the 17th of October as well, and 15 voting centres. And I encourage the community to take part in the opportunity to vote early to further enhance their provisions around safety in these current conditions. So I will now pause. We'll invite questions either via the chat or direct means, but noting that we've only got a total of 2 hours for this assigned, I'm keen whereby we can move into the next section and Ro can talk to some of the specifics and we can engage in a more fulsome question session towards the end. But happy to take immediate questions. And I'll just pause for a moment whilst I engage the staff for a moment. Okay, where will the information be displayed about the waiting times at voting centres? So thank you very much for that question. I will provide more information about the facility that we'll provide, but it will be available on a link that will be prominent on the Elections ACT website. We'll make more information available that as we develop that facility. Okay, look, rather than chew time now, I will now hand over to my Deputy Ro Spence and invite him to continue with the presentation. I look forward to engaging with you later on this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy.
Okay, thank you everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Ro Spence. I'm the Deputy Electoral Commissioner at the ACT Electoral Commission. I'll just jump straight into it and start talking about electronic voting and counting at the ACT election. We've had EVACs, as we know it, in existence in the ACT since the 2001 election. It has largely been upgraded or improved in between each election, but since the 2016 election, it has had probably the largest upgrade that it's seen in its existence. And a significant element of that is the introduction of touchscreen user interface. And so electronic voting is available at each of the voting locations across Canberra that will be open for that 3-week voting period that Damien's just been discussing. The introduction of a touchscreen voting interface has a number of benefits. Of course, it's a much more user-friendly means in which electors can use the system and cast their vote. But it also has the ability, the benefit of being able to easily and regularly be disinfected after the use by voters. There will still, of course, be one terminal in each of the of those voting locations for blind and vision impaired electors who can cast their vote using headphones and a telephone-style keypad to navigate across the ballot paper. But the vast majority of users will use the new touchscreen interface. E-voting officers will be available in each of those locations to ensure safe voting conditions by wiping and disinfecting those screens, and also to provide assistance to electors should they need it. The other advantage of electronic voting is that it allows for an interim distribution of preferences to be run very soon after the close of polls on that final day of voting. And with the way the voting will be conducted in 2020, and with the knowledge that from previous elections that we know that around 90% of voters who vote in one of those locations uses electronic voting, that interim distribution of preferences will use a sample of votes that really will be quite a significant number of votes, and that will provide a very good and very early indication of the outcome of the election. So that's a significant element to it, electronic voting in the ACT. So really moving now on to some of those other key party and candidate information that we're here to impart today. Moving on to authorisation matters. So what is electoral matter? It's material in printed or electronic form intended or likely to affect voting at an election. And that's the key phrase there, intended or likely to affect voting at an election. And it really hinges on a number of elements, the key one being performance. So if the electoral matter is mentioning the performance of a political entity, for instance, the government or the opposition, a candidate, an MLA, a former candidate or MLA, any of those elements, then it is considered electoral matter. And also if it references an issue that is before electors at the election, then it is also considered electoral matter. So why does the term electoral matter matter? It's because it appears in a number of key areas within the Electoral Act. It appears when we're discussing matters related to electoral expenditure, and it appears when discussing matters related to campaigning. So we'll discuss the latter point mentioned there first, the dissemination of electoral matter. The point of authorisation law is to promote a free and informed voting at elections by enhancing the transparency, by allowing voters to know who is communicating electoral matter, the accountability of those persons participating in public debate relating to electoral matter. So by making those persons responsible for their communication. And it allows the Electoral Commission a better sense of who is communicating the electoral matter. And so it's the traceability of those communications that the inclusion of those electoral authorisation statements so that we can contact some of those participants and let them know of their obligations under the Electoral Act. So when people see or hear or read things that they need to be able to judge for themselves, if that information is reliable. Authorisation law is intended to prevent irresponsibility through anonymity, requiring participants to make the reader aware of who is authorising that electoral material. So almost all printed and electronic electoral matter must include an authorisation statement. And that authorisation statement consists of three key elements. The first one is the first and the last name of the person who is authorising that matter. It must also include a statement that that person is authorising that matter. And then if the statement is on behalf of a political candidate or a political party, then it must include a statement that is published on or by that party or candidate. And a new law recently introduced just in the last week or so also requires that the name of an entity be included in an authorisation statement. So that's for third-party campaigners, but also just the wider community. If they are producing something that would be considered electoral matter, they need to include the name of the entity as part of that statement. So it says up there that almost all printed or electronic matter requires an authorisation statement, and that's because there are some exceptions. Media releases, letters from an MLA, those things do have exemptions within the Electoral Act. But the key is that the matter is not anonymous, and so letters from an MLA are often quite clearly not anonymous. Media releases are not anonymous. So that's really at the heart of authorisation, that the matter being produced is able to be tracked back by the person reading it to who authorised it. And the Electoral Commission we often advise that when in doubt, include an authorisation statement. An authorisation statement doesn't in and of itself mean that something is electoral matter, and it doesn't in and of itself mean that the costs in producing it would fall within the expenditure cap. But the inclusion of an authorisation statement does ensure that you're in compliance if that matter does require one, if it is electoral matter. And I think also that it's of interest to the Electoral Commission, and I think each party and candidate involved, to avoid external queries of compliance. So when in doubt, include an authorisation statement. It's also really key to understand that authorisation statements are required at all times. It's not just in an election year. If you are producing electoral matter, that electoral matter should include a statement. Included here are just some examples of authorisation statements. As you can see, authorised by name and entity on whose behalf it is authorised. Also, a key element to an authorisation statement is the font size in which it's produced. And the important thing to note here is that it is in a readable size for the intended use. So if it's a poster or a billboard, for example, then it needs to be in a font that can be read at the distance that it's intended to be read from. If it's a brochure, then a font size that's easily readable within a brochure. Authorisation on the internet. So the law doesn't prescribe where the authorisation statement should appear on a website or social media pages, but generally speaking, it should appear on each page in a website that contains electoral matter, or alternatively, it could be included in the footer of the web page so that it just appears on every page of a website that does include electoral matter. And it's also important to note that if a web page contains links to documents that contain electoral matter, for example, fact sheets or newsletters, that those documents themselves contain an authorisation statement in case that connection to the website is broken. So if those fact sheets are intended to be printed and distributed from that website, then it's important that they then include their own authorisation statement. In terms of social media, again, there's no rule about where that authorisation statement should appear, but our recommendation is always that it either appear in the About section of that social media page, or you could embed it within the banner graphic or something along those lines, just so it's quite easily found by someone searching for it. It's not necessary to authorise every tweet or post or even infographic. Infographics, if they are created by your social media page, even if those infographics are shared by other users, the original link goes back to the original publisher, and they can trace that back to your social media page, your About section, where it has that authorisation statement. Damien mentioned earlier that we are about to embark on a new element of our information campaign called Check Your Source. It's aimed at raising awareness, educating electors of the need to consider and review the source of their electoral communication so that electors can avoid being misled by disinformation and can cast an informed vote at the ACT Legislative Assembly election. It's asking people to consider whether the source is reliable, whether when the material was published, is it still current? Could the information be a scam? So that's a new element. You'll see that commencing on social media platforms only, and digital online advertisements in late July. So that quite soon you'll start seeing some of those if you're using some of those social media platforms. Moving on to nominations. So nominations for this forthcoming ACT election open on the 11th of September. We do not make the nomination form available until much closer to the period in which nominations open. So we will make the nomination form available upon request from the 4th of September. And the reason for that is that particularly for non-party candidates who need to seek the nomination of at least 20 nominators within the electorate in which the candidate is contesting, it's important that they are, those signatures and those nominations are captured very close to that nomination period, so that if they have any changes to their enrolment detail since you've received those signatures, that they are still eligible to nominate you. So we don't make that available until the 4th of September, at which point you can call our office and we will be able to send you that nomination form. It's also, so nominations then close at 12 noon on the 23rd of September. So the nominations are open from 11 September to 12 noon on the 23rd of September. We strongly encourage that you do not leave your nomination until the last moment. If there is a problem with your nomination form, commencing the nomination process early allows you to fix that error prior to noon on the 23rd of September. If you are to attend to nominate as a candidate or nominate your candidates if you are a registered officer for a political party, too close to that cutoff and you need to seek additional candidates, for instance, nominators, for instance, you have until 12 noon on the 23rd of September to do that. If you have to come back after that date, your nomination may well be rejected. So when you nominate, it is a $250 deposit per candidate, and that must be currently either in cash or a banker's cheque. Personal cheques won't be accepted. We are, though, looking into cashless payments, particularly in this COVID-affected environment. And so we're working through the details of that at the moment. Hopefully we'll have that available come September. But at the moment, cash or banker's cheque will be the only means to accept your deposit. We will update the candidate's handbook should cashless payments be available. As mentioned before, registered political parties, individual candidates within that party do not need to nominate individually. In fact, a registered officer or a deputy registered officer, should a party have one set up, are the only positions within a registered party that can nominate candidates. So it's important prior to September to get that process and the person identified who will be able to nominate candidates for registered political parties. Non-party candidates, like I said, they need to be nominated by at least 20 electors eligible to vote for the electorate in which the candidate is contesting. The candidate themselves doesn't actually need to be registered in that electorate, but the nominators do. Also, at the point of nomination, that is where a non-party candidate can choose to include the word independent underneath their name on the ballot paper. That's a choice that non-party candidates can make. And it's also the point at which registered political parties can choose to have either their registered political party name or their registered abbreviation as the name at the top of the column on the ballot papers. The space to make those determinations is included on the nomination form. And then the declaration of nominations, that will be held 24 hours after the close of nominations. So that will be the 12th, at 12 noon on the 24th of September. And at that point, there will be a ballot draw for positions and the nominations will then be published on the Elections ACT website. I'll mention in a bit later about some new legislation, but it's worthwhile at this point to discuss the new legislation around candidate statements. The Electoral Commission is now required to host a web page that includes statements provided by candidates or registered parties or the registered officer of a party for each of their candidates, should they choose to, of up to 500 words, a photograph if they choose, and links to external websites if they choose. And then we will run a draw for positions for the order in which those candidate statements will be presented on our website. But it's important to note that we cannot accept those candidate statements until after the declaration of nominations, so after the 24th of September. And we would very much prefer that we receive those candidate statements in electronic form rather than handwritten or hard copy version. But details of this will be included in the candidate handbook very, very shortly. Moving on to names on the ballot paper. So the legislation provides that it must be the enrolled surname of the candidate. It must be the enrolled given name or an accepted variation of that name or even an initial. But what it can't be is a nickname. Nicknames cannot be used, displayed on ballot papers. So what is electoral expenditure? Electoral expenditure is expenditure incurred when producing or disseminating electoral matter, and we've already discussed the definition of electoral matter. So that includes the costs for designing, producing, publishing, things like corflute signs, t-shirts, stickers, anything that is considered electoral matter. It also includes the costs of engaging consultants and advertising agents in relation to electoral matter. And also things like opinion polling to support electoral matter. What it doesn't include is the general administration expenses of your sorry, getting some strange sounds going on. So your ongoing staff costs are not considered electoral expenditure. But if you were to engage someone, for example, in the election to support the development of a website, they're not usually an ongoing staff member, then the costs, their salary costs or the costs of engaging them is considered electoral expenditure. It's also really important to understand about when those costs are incurred. You could, for instance, you could have maybe produced some posters in 2018 in preparation for the 2020 election, paid the invoice all the way back in 2018, but the costs are incurred in terms of electoral expenditure when you use that electoral matter. So if the posters are used within an election year, even though you paid for them many years ago, then those costs need to be included within the electoral expenditure cap. And when submitting your election return, and we'll get to the details of election returns a bit later on, there will be specific categories of electoral expenditure that need to be reported against. For instance, it's going to ask you for the total expenditure for broadcasting, broadcasting electoral advertisements, consultant fees. They're separate line items within an electoral return. So that's really important that you're keeping robust records of where that expenditure, of what that expenditure is and what categories it's attributable to. So why is the concept of electoral expenditure and electoral matter important? Well, that's because there is an electoral expenditure cap in place. And for the 2020 election, that cap's $42,750. The expenditure cap limits the amount of money that can be spent on an election campaign between the 1st of January in an election year, so 1st of January 2020, and the end of election date, so 17 October 2020. That's the electoral expenditure cap period, and candidates, and the cap for that is $42,750. So non-party candidates and their campaign team have an expenditure cap of $42,750. Associated entities have an expenditure cap of $42,750. Third-party campaigners have an expenditure cap of $42,750. The expenditure cap for a party grouping is $42,750 per candidate, multiplied by the number of candidates that party is running in that election. And that's to a maximum of 25, so 5 candidates within each of the 5 electorates. So a party grouping that's running the full 5 candidates in all 5 electorates has a maximum expenditure cap in the 2020 election of $1,068,750. And there are penalties if that expenditure cap is exceeded. So if an entity breaches the cap, it's liable to pay a penalty to the territory equal to twice the amount by which the electoral expenditure cap is breached. So if it's breached by 10,000, then the penalty is 20,000. So moving on to funding expenditure and financial disclosures. There are really 3 types of disclosures within the Electoral Act. There's the reporting of gifts totaling $1,000 or more, and we're currently in a phase that they need to be disclosed within 7 days of receiving that gift. Then, of course, there's annual returns, and they're due every year on the 31st of August, which is fast approaching. And then there's election returns, and they're due 60 days after polling day. So we'll start by discussing gift returns. So what is a gift? A gift is the giving of money without the expectation of anything in return. It's the giving of services without the expectation of anything in return, and that's known as a gift in kind. A gift in kind, for example, might be a printing company offering to print pamphlets for a party or a candidate at no charge, or perhaps maybe free legal advice, something like that. So that's considered a gift in kind. But when disclosing the details of a gift in kind, you need to be providing the value of that gift and some information in relation to the justification of how that value was determined. A gift is also the part of party membership fees that are in excess of the first $250. So the first $250 is not considered a gift. Anything over $250 in a party membership requirement fee is considered a gift. And similarly, the part of a fundraising contribution that is more than $250 is considered a gift. But we'll get into the details of fundraising contributions shortly. So as many of you might be aware, because we've been communicating this since early in 2019, there have been some changes to the Commonwealth Electoral Act that have come into effect since the 1st of January 2019. And in fact, I read some media reporting on this matter again just last night, so it's still quite topical. The changes to the Commonwealth Electoral Act have had the effect of limiting the operation of the ACT's funding and disclosure scheme in relation to the disclosure of gifts in certain circumstances. But it is important to note that the funding and disclosure provisions within the ACT Electoral Act have not changed, but its operation has been impacted by the Commonwealth law. So in certain circumstances, the party grouping may not have to disclose gifts to the ACT Electoral Commission due to the impact of that Commonwealth law. However, it is the Electoral Commission's view, having reviewed the various pieces of legislation, that gifts provided to candidates in the election still have disclosure obligations under the ACT Electoral Act. So, and notwithstanding the impact of that Commonwealth Electoral Act, the ACT Electoral Commission does, in the interest of transparency, encourage a continuance of disclosure in line with the ACT's funding and disclosure scheme. That would meet the intent of the Electoral Act. So what is not a gift? A gift is money or received in a private capacity for private use. So for example, if your grandmother was to hide a $10 note in your birthday card, that would not be considered a gift for electoral purposes and is not disclosable. Affiliation fees paid to a party or compulsory levies paid to a party by parties' elected representatives, and I know that's the case for some registered parties out there, they are not considered a gift. They would be considered receipts. It's, as we've discussed, the part of any membership fee that is less than $250, and also the administrative expenditure funding that the Electoral Commission pays to represented political parties is not considered a gift either, nor is the election funding paid by the Electoral Commission to candidates or parties who have reached the particular threshold in the Act following the election. So as I discussed, we get to what a fundraising contribution is. It's a payment made by a person or an organisation as a contribution, entry fee or other payment to entitle that person or another person to participate in or gain benefit from a fundraising event. And a fundraising event is an event where any part of the funds raised are retained by a party or candidate or even third-party campaigner or any political participant, however that may be described. So it could be a ticket in a raffle, it might be an item that someone purchases in a fundraising auction, it may be a meal or a beverage. But as I previously stated, the first $250 of those contributions is not considered a gift, but anything above that does need to be disclosed. Anonymous gifts. So an Anonymous gift is a gift received where the donor of the gift is unknown. And there are some legislative provisions around that. So parties and candidates are not permitted to accept anonymous gifts of over $1,000. So if you were to receive a gift without knowing who the donor of that gift was, and that gift was over $1,000, it's payable to the territory. It's also not permitted to keep more than $25,000 worth of anonymous gifts in a financial year. As I stated, any breach of those laws, those amounts are recoverable by the territory. So gift returns, we'll get into now the specifics of each of the returns that need to be provided: gift returns, annual returns, and election returns. And we'll start with gift returns. So when a gift is received over $1,000, whether that's in a single gift or an amalgamation of the number of gifts received from the same individual or entity, you need to be submitting a gift return. The timing for the disclosure of those gift returns is dependent upon the period in which we are in that 4-year election cycle. And currently we're in the cycle where if you receive a gift or an amalgamation of those gifts of over $1,000, you need to be disclosing the details of that gift to the Electoral Commission within 7 days of the gift having been received, or the total of that gift, of the gifts received by a single person or entity goes above that $1,000 threshold. And it's going to remain a 7-day reporting period until the end of election day. So that's where we're at the moment. But as you can see on the slide, the disclosure timeframes change depending on the period of that election, 4-year election cycle. Most of the time within that cycle, the timeframe is 30 days after the end of the financial quarter in which the gifts were received. But as the election gets closer, those timeframes get more regular. Our fact sheets and our manuals have a lot more detail on that, and I would encourage you to review those publications for more details about what needs to be disclosed and by when. Third-party campaigners are required to disclose gifts as part of their election return. They don't have a requirement within the 7-day reporting schedule. All gifts disclosed to third-party campaigners are disclosed via the election return following the election. And as soon as we receive those gift disclosures, the Electoral Commission will make those public by publishing them on our elections website as soon as possible. So moving on to annual returns. Clearly, an annual return is based on a financial year, and indeed they're due on the 31st of August, and we'll be writing to the various political parties and other relevant entities very, very shortly, with reminders to complete and lodge your current annual return. Associated entities and MLAs are also required to lodge annual returns, and it requires the disclosure of a total of all receipts, including gifts, payments, debts outstanding, including disputed debts, as at the 30th of June. Details of receipts totaling $1,000 or more from the same person or organisation during that year, and details of debts, including disputed debts, totaling $1,000 or more to the same person or organisation, again as at the 30th of June. So moving on to election returns. Election returns for a party grouping detail the electoral expenditure incurred in that election expenditure cap period, so the 1st of January to the 17th of October. As stated earlier, it asks for the totals within some specific categories of that electoral expenditure. However, for third-party campaigners and non-party candidates, the election return also requires those entities to disclose the gifts received during that period. So that's within the election return as well. And election returns are due on the 16th of December this year. And the Electoral Commission makes those details public on its website at about the start of February. So disclosure compliance reviews. The Electoral Commission is empowered by the Electoral Act to issue investigation notices to examine the financial records of political entities. We're required to give 28 days notice to review the financial records of that entity. And it's important to note that that review of financial records can include personal financial bank account details for candidates and MLAs. So if that's not something that a candidate or an MLA wishes to happen, it's important that separate bank accounts are established under which electoral expenditure may be drawn from and gifts received may be deposited into. So that's a key point there, that if you are receiving gifts into a personal bank account or spending money from a personal bank account on an electoral matter, then the Electoral Commission may seek to have visibility of those financial records. And so the disclosure compliance reviews look into electoral expenditure, gift reporting, the use of administrative funds received by represented parties, and compliance with annual return requirements. So because of those compliance review requirements, it's therefore important that entities maintain a robust and accurate record-keeping system. For example, if a donation was made, it's important to keep records of whether it was, say, the CEO of an organisation who made that donation personally, or was it the organisation themselves. That kind of information is important and will be reviewed by the Electoral Commission or people on behalf of the Electoral Commission as part of these compliance reviews. Entities must distinguish between something that is a receipt and something that is a gift. So membership fees under $250 is considered a receipt. Maybe rent from an investment property owned by a political party is considered a receipt. And I've discussed what is a gift earlier. Parties also need to ensure that the candidates within their party understand what is required in terms of records for electoral expenditure and gifts received, because it's the party itself who needs to disclose details in its various returns. So the to facilitate that, the Electoral Commission has made available a spreadsheet, which I believe will be on our website very, very shortly, but can also be provided upon request. And it's really for parties to distribute to its candidates so that those candidates can record expenditure and gifts received. It's not a mandated practice, but it is something that we supply to assist in the party's record keepings to see if it can help in any way. So if that's something that's of interest to you, please get in contact and we can provide it to you for your provision to your candidates. So just to finish up my presentation, we'll just talk quickly about some legislative assembly amendments that have been introduced since the 2016 election, and quite a major change that was passed a week or two ago is changes to electoral enrolment. So the electoral roll now closes on the 11th of September at 6 p.m. for anyone currently on the electoral roll. So if someone was to change their address and re-enroll after the 11th of September, that enrolment change would not take effect on the roll that's used within polling places for that election. Now that's really no different to how the system has worked in the past. What has changed, however, is the roll is not closed to brand new enrolments. So people enrolling from another state or territory, or maybe someone enrolling for the first time, if they turn up to a polling place and are found to be not on the roll, they will be given the opportunity to enrol so that their declaration vote, which they would need to complete within a polling place, may be admitted once the Australian Electoral Commission has added that person to the electoral roll. The 100-metre boundary, the prohibition on canvassing within 100 metres of the polling place remains. However, there has been a small change that removes the ability for that 100 metres to start from any enclosure surrounding a polling place. There was the ability to make that 100-metre start at a fence. that ability has been removed. So across the board now is 100 metres from the building in which a polling place is located, and it's 100 metres from every aspect of that building. There's also been a change to the Public Unleased Land Act that now allows authorised officers to immediately remove electoral advertising signs that don't comply with the requirements of the Electoral Act. So that's essentially authorisation statements, or the inclusion of one, or the Code of Practice for Public Land. Previously, prior notice was required, but the new legislation allows city rangers to immediately remove offending electoral advertising signs. It's important to note that the ACT Electoral Commission does not have jurisdiction over the removal of those signs. That is something under the eyes of the city rangers. So any referral to the Electoral Commission is referred straight onto those city rangers. I've already mentioned the candidate information statement website that Elections ACT will now be hosting. And Damien very quickly mentioned that we are working towards an electronic voting service specifically for electors who are overseas, and that's particularly important now in a COVID environment, which is where the postal voting service is significantly impacted by COVID. So we're seeking to implement that system prior to the 2020 election, and also a telephone voting service for electors who are blind and vision impaired and find it difficult to get to one of our voting locations over that 3-week voting period. A very minor change also is how fractional transfer values are calculated when we're doing a distribution of preferences following an election. They used to be rounded down to whole fractions. They are now able to be calculated to 6 decimal places. So that's just another fairly minor change in the Electoral Act since the 2016 election. So really that ends the information I'm here to provide to you. I'll open it up to questions as we did before, but I'll also just leave the next slide available so that the contact information for some of the information that we've been discussing here is readily available for you. So bring up questions.
Whilst we're just, if I may, preparing for those questions, thanks for able to take a breath. I just want to touch on a couple of things which I should have included in the presentation earlier, and that is the actual opening times of the voting centres. And again, I stress this because this is a variation from years past. So I mentioned before the election period from the 28th September through to the 17th of October. I want to emphasise that the polling locations will be open, and this relates to the early voting centres, from the 28th September. They'll be open Monday to Thursday. Will be open from 9 AM to 5 PM, which will include the public holiday scheduled for ACT on the Monday the 5th of October. For Fridays, the election period, that's the 2nd of October, the 9th and the 16th of October. Those hours will be extended, so they'll go from 9 AM to 8 PM on those 3 Fridays within the election period. And on the Saturdays and Sundays, it's also open from 9 to 5. So where that might not have been the situation for early voting centres previously, so as to give everyone the best opportunity to attend a voting location, particularly the early voting centre, as we encourage with the least degree of risk to themselves or others around them as it relates to potential social distance breaching. They're open on the weekends as well from 9 to 5. And on the polling day, as I've indicated before, we'll endeavour to produce the traditional number of polling locations, approximately 70 or more polling locations on the 17th of October, and the hours of operation will, as has been the case in previous years, from 8 AM to 6 PM. We'll advise other details around telephone voting, the registration for such and the like on our website as we lock those details down. And we want to make sure that that information is available to those who would be eligible and wish to take and make use of that potential service. we'll just go through some of the questions that I note have been provided to us, and I note now we're just over an hour into the allocated 2 hours. And I'll just highlight a couple of these, and I'll answer these where I may. For some of the more technical issues, I'll ask Ro to fill in the gaps. So the first question I have here is, will the early voting centres open all over the electorate? So yes, the location of the early voting centres is being determined as we speak. We're close to having the intended and desired number of polling locations being open over the early voting period, that is 15. We'll advise those shortly as part of the public information campaign, but clearly they will be. The plan is to distribute them appropriately across the ACT, across each respective electorate, so that there's equal opportunity across where voters will live and reside to be able to access one of those early voting centres. There's a couple of questions here that relate to potential contingencies. If, touch wood, the pandemic worsens significantly and ACT government, through the Public Health Act or emergency, requires further lockdowns to occur or restrictions on community movement and engagement. There are a range of contingencies which we continue to refine within our election planning. The Electoral Act makes provision for what's referred to as a extension of the election. The plan which we have developed and have socialised and has been developed with the assistance of ACT Health in particular, and as we briefed to the ACT Assembly, and has now been provisioned for by way of legislation and funding, provides for the circumstances of variations of these circumstances under which we're all living and working at the moment. Should there be subsequent emergency legislation or legislation that the government may wish to put in place to accommodate a potential eventuality of significant social restrictions, lockdowns, as you might refer to them, then we'll get to that when we'll get that through our contingency planning that will continue to be refined as we progress. But rest assured that there are three key areas which the Elections ACT, we've worked with the Assembly members in developing the election plan, and they are the community health and safety as voters go about taking part in this election, the health and safety of the election staff, all the political stakeholders associated with this undertaking, and to ensure the integrity of the electoral process, and that everyone's given every opportunity as they are required to, due by law, to take part in this process and have their political expression noted and recorded. There's a couple of other questions here which I'll go to very quickly. I might actually ask Ro, this one in particular relates to candidates getting the nomination form. Will they collect it from the office in hard copy or can it be emailed? I suppose it's going to the question of access to the office. And I might ask just Ro to address that one. And there's a couple of other specifics here which talks to declarations and the like, which I'll leave on the table here and Ro can refer to these. We'll get to these and also engage those which are coming up on the screen as we progress. There's a bit of flying here. One here relates particular to non-forms, yes.
Yeah, so yes, the nomination form can be picked up from the office. It can be emailed or it can be sent to you in hard copy via the post. So no problem there. I'll go to answer some of those questions. Indira has asked, is it okay to reuse materials from previous elections and not count to the 2020 electoral expenditure cap? No. In fact, if you are, let's say, using, for example, call flute signs from the 2016 election, and you use those again in the 2020 election, the costs of the production and dissemination of those needs to be included in the 2020 electoral expenditure cap. The intention of the electoral expenditure cap within the law is that it presents a level playing field for all participants. So it doesn't allow for the stockpiling of electoral matter that was used in previous elections and used again in another election and then not count to that expenditure cap. So those costs do need to be included in the 2020 electoral expenditure cap. There's a question here from Alvin. I'm not sure I understand it. If you could rephrase that and repost it, that would be appreciated. From Sue Ingram, is there a format set of questions? Is there a format or set of questions to be addressed in the candidate statement? So that's a really good question. The answer to that is no. It is entirely up to the party and or candidates what is included within that 500 or up to 500 word statement. However, there are some things within the new legislation, such as it cannot be obscene, what's the other word? Defamatory. And we will provide a little bit more information within the candidate information handbook fairly shortly to provide some more guidance of that. But no, there is no set format. We've already spoken about where those voting centres will be, but they will also be advertised quite widely, not only on our own website, but also in household brochures. We'll be sending out 2 household brochures to every household in the ACT, and the details of the locations of the voting centres will be included in one of those household brochures, much closer to the voting period. Fiona's asked what can be done about the removal of candidate posters from public notice boards. Much like I was discussing about roadside signs, that's not the jurisdiction of the ACT Electoral Commission, it's the jurisdiction of city rangers. So if there's a question about the removal of campaigning type material, that does need to go to the city rangers, not the ACT Electoral Commission. So a question following on from the question about the use of materials from a previous election. It is the full cost of the production of those materials at the time that they were produced and disseminated. There's no means of aggregating or reducing those costs. Mohammed, I think, has raised a question about Section 44 of the Constitution, Australian Constitution. I'm assuming that's what it means. And in particular, I'm assuming that's discussing whether someone can be a dual citizen. There is no limitation in the ACT Legislative Assembly on dual citizens contesting elections and sitting as MLAs. But for a full information on the eligibility requirements for candidates and to sit as an MLA, have a look at our candidate information handbook. It's got full details in there, but you can be a dual citizen. Section 44 of the Constitution is not a concern at an ACT level. So Alvin's question is, his understanding that services above the value of $250 must be declared as income. But what if someone, a party member who has special knowledge, provides services to the party? So again, I'm not entirely sure what that question is talking about. If someone is providing services to a political party, that is considered a gift in kind. And if it's over $1,000, it needs to be disclosed within a gift disclosure. I'm not sure. Alvin, perhaps you should engage with us outside of this to really define the question and us to provide you with a considered answer to that. Feel free to call our office or send an email. Okay. If there are any further questions relating to the matters we've discussed, please feel free to contact our office or via phone or email to discuss those matters in more detail. Be happy and welcome to discuss those.
Good. Okay, thank you. I think I've already been through those chat questions. We've covered most of those. Again, as Rose indicated, absolutely, we're about providing information and advice, and we look forward to engaging any individual or candidate or party to help them understand the process. Except there are some technicalities around the funding and disclosure provisions, in particular, that can be a bit daunting, but they will be laid out in the handbook, and also the team here who've got some deep experience in some of these matters will be happy to engage your question, and where necessary we'll reach back for a specific interpretation of the Act as it currently stands. So I'll just pause for a moment whilst we allow people to reflect upon the presentation, perhaps ask additional questions before we close out, and I'll just pause there for a moment or two. All right, ladies and gentlemen, again, I thank you for your attendance this afternoon. A very important part of the community campaign, the information campaign. This is the first leading to that. As I said, I undertake to ensure that the information that should be on our website is provided to you in its new form and as accurate as it should be by early next month. So our staff are working on making those amendments where appropriate, arising from that legislative amendments just very recently. But again, I emphasise we're very welcoming of any requests for information you may have of us. Last, if I leave you with the messages, it's please stay informed. On our behalf, you play an important role in delivering some of these key messages to the jurisdiction, to your constituents. Remain attuned to the official government advice as relates to ACT health provisions. They're very important and they underpin everything we're doing as it relates to provision of safety for all of us, ACT members involved in this very important activity. And it's an election period. The early voting is actively encouraged so as to ensure every opportunity is given to vote safely in this pandemic era. But the voting period from 28th September through to and including the 17th of October, so a variation from where we've been before, and we'll be taking particular precautions to provide the best safe, COVID safe environment we can. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your notes of thank you, and we look forward to engaging you as we progress through the information period and answer your questions as they might arise. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Damon. Thank you, Rob.